the person. And so just as this gives us this general kind of biological clock through the doshas, there's a similar kind of timing cycle that we see within Jyotish as well, called Naisargika Dasha. And it's this base kind of biological clock, so to speak, this base nature that everyone goes through as a human being, based on planetary associations. And this really opens up the field a lot further, because when we start bringing in the planets, not only do we get a little more discernment through specific times and ages with the planetary periods, but also all the archetypes and all that the planets embody really show themselves at the different times in our life. And so this is not only a basic kind of foundational timing system, it can also get nuanced with sub-periods, and also specific to the person's chart, which we'll look at how to use this. So it was traditionally taught as the first timing system one should learn. And before Vimshotari or any Chara dashas or sign dashas or anything, there's this Naisargika, which is a planetary based dasha. So it's really going to show what we're getting from nature and just these natural periods, and what's going to manifest easier in different periods of our life. And it's a really useful tool to predict. So I put the ages up here, which you can read on your own, but there's little variations here and there from certain texts, but this is the general good standard age to work with. And within that too, you're going to see different things pop up within the chart depending on how strong or weak they are. So for example, Mars is the age when we usually start to walk at 1, which is true for most people. However, if Mars is heavily afflicted in a chart, the walking can be delayed. However, if Mars is really strong in a chart, then the walking can happen early. And so like this, you can see when things are manifesting in their life, and it can give you a clue into this state of that person's planet in the chart. What this does is, it gives us a good insight into what's going on in that phase of life. So moon 0 to 1, shouldn't need too much introduction for those who are been following along with the lessons. Moon is the mother, it's the nurturance, just like that Kapha dosha rules the first part of life. This is just the first year. So, the mind, the senses, it's all getting wired up. Mars is that time of will that, the kid can walk, starting to speak. It's really trying to figure things out. It's when they start breaking a lot of things, so all these kind of Martian qualities come up. And so this is also a critical time when kids do develop their will. So if you have an overly protective, cautious parent always getting on top of their child at this time, that can create problems in the will later on in life, and something, to watch out for with parenting. And then Mercury, it's a planet of learning, being, it can be a playful planet. 3 to 12, we pick up our languages at this time, and they say the languages, if you introduce them, 3 to 8 is like really an important window of time there. And generally 12 is the time of puberty, which is when Venus hits in. And from 12 to 32, it's all about our relationships, and finding the wife, settling down, figuring out the whole job situation, and solidifying the friends, and, who we are, how we interact with that. That whole reality is really the strongest in Venus. And so once again, back to this prediction element, that's when we really look in the chart to see the state of Venus and other planets with it. We move into Jupiter, and that's when the children come. Jupiter is planet of children, but it's this planet of growth and growing. So we're starting to make our income, make our mark in life, figure out the housing and everything else that comes, and we keep expanding until we're around 50, which is the sun period, which is when we're authority. This is when we come into our position of power, prestige. A lot of politicians are older and in this age range of 50 to 70, and sun's a very political planet. So like this, and then Saturn, who should need no introduction, closes out life, and you can put those two together. Some include Lagna after 120 or somewhere in there, and so it's not really practical for most of us. I haven't included in here, but there is a place for Lagna. And once again, there is some variations with how it's laid out, but this is what we're using and the general good basis to start with. Now, the most interesting thing about this dasha, or one of the very interesting things, is that if we look to modern psychological theories, is that it lines up quite well. It's not a one-to-one match, but we see that, especially with Erik Erikson's work, who he kind of spun off of Freud, we do see Freud's work. He stops, we see 0 to 1.5 or so is the moon, 1.5 to 3 once again is the Mars, 3 to 6. So he breaks up the 3 to puberty age, that Mercury age, into 2 areas, and then puberty to adulthood is Venus, and he stops there. So, one big critique of Freud is obviously he was obsessed with the sexual nature of things, and so it's interesting that he stops at that Venus age. Quite handy. Now, if we look at Erikson, who was developed some of those ideas further, and actually did a lot of study on this. So there's tons and tons of case studies out there on all this, and what he came up with for these ages, and this is based on empirical research, lines up quite well with what the rishis had come up with, and all these ancient. It's even in the Greek text, this dasha system, so it runs across cultures. It was used widely, but we see. Once again, 0 to 1.5, trust versus mistrust. You're learning that through the moon, and so you can see that in a chart. If the moon's heavily afflicted, there can be trust issues, there can be emotional issues around that. 1.5 to 3, once again, the Mars age, autonomy, that will coming out or not. And then Erikson, once again, he breaks down the mercurial ages into 2 parts: initiative versus guilt, and industry versus inferiority. So, these elements of learning are coming around. And I'm not totally versed in Erikson, so I don't know exactly how it lines up specifically, but this is something you can look into, and it has, it can have implications for your Jyotish to look deeper into it. And then 12 to 18. So once again, we see a little split here. 12 to 18, 18 to 40. That Venus age gets split up, and at the end we see 40 to 65, which would be somewhere with the Sun. So that Jupiter Sun's a little mixed in here, but we see generativity versus stagnation. That expansive Jupiter qualities coming into some of it, but along with that generativity, that Sun quality around 50. If we get recognition for our work or not. And then at the end of it, which could play into this ego identity versus despair, right? So not quite to the Shani age. Maybe Shani is the despair part. Ego identity is that Sun, good, healthy ego, which the Sun gives in strides if it's strong. So there's some overlap here, but it's an area for further research. But it's just a very interesting how they've broken down very similar age patterns and age periods when compared with the Jyotish timings, which we use within the chart. Basic application, which I've hinted at some of this once again, in order to start reading it, is we use the basic Naisargika indications of the planets for prediction. So we're looking, as I've already said, Jupiter period, kids, growth, that kind of thing. Venus period, relationships. Venus does have a lot to do with learning on a more secular level. So, learning our trade, our values. It's a Rajasic planet. You also want to see what it's conjoined with. So just like we read anything else in a chart, see what planets it's with, see what's, you can see what's aspecting it, see what house it's placed in, these kind of basic indications to read the basic readings. And we're just looking at Mahadashas here, so these are bigger time periods we're looking at. And then, those time periods, these things will be highlighted, they'll bring the results. And as I mentioned earlier too, it's important to predict based with this in the background. One big thing to do with this, and everyone wants to know about relationships and money, right? So one of the really useful ways to use this is predicting, can relationships come later or before? So, 12 to 32 is that natural period when, yes, relationships can manifest, and it's a lot easier to find someone. But if you switch into a Jupiter period, for example, and Venus has like no association with Jupiter, then it's a lot harder to find a partner if you enter that Jupiter period, if you haven't already been married or found someone. And then if you go into your Sun period, for example, and Venus is with the Sun, then it's possible to find someone in the later life. It makes it a lot easier, and this is super useful for looking at these things, and you can understand why sometimes people just don't want to be in relationships because of something like this. So it has a lot of uses like that, and that's the basic setup. And you also have to take into consider the whole nature of the chart. So sometimes it can get overridden. If someone does have a very strong Venusian nature, it could bring a window of opportunity. Likewise, if Venus is connected to some of these other planets in a chart, in like the D9, then it might open up something later. But in general, if the Naisargika placements in the Rashi are not promising things, then it makes it that much harder. And so like this, it's really important to look at it in the basic predictive backdrop once you start learning Vimshotri and a sign-based Dasha system, which most astrologers really should learn. Super important to get accurate predictions, especially when things are lining up across different Dasha systems. But this is kind of basic one to really learn. So to look at this in a chart, to bring it kind of home a little more, we see here a native, and if we look, if we want to look at the first year of life, once again, we go to the moon. We can see, the conditions of the mother and everything to the moon. So we see there's a strong connection between our mother and that first year of life that we brought in. It's not that, it's not that the mother, there's this whole thing, nature versus nurture, this kind of thing. Is it the mother in those early years of incubation, is that causing to us? When you start looking at the charts and see this at play a lot, you see, how we've brought these things in. So it's this symbiosis. It's not really one or the other so much. So for this native, we see here the moon is right on the ascendant. It's in great enemy dignity, so not the best dignity for the moon. It's in a Saturn sign, and it's with Ketu, a pretty strong malefic. And so right away we can see there's probably some struggle here in the early life, and indeed this person was given up for adoption when she was very young. Her mother actually left, just didn't want to be there. And there's other indications here too for that, so we also have to look at other things, but right away we can get a hit on that first year of life. And the mother as well. Ketu's a headless planet, so some mistakes may have been made, that kind of thing. All sorts of indications we can get here, but just going to keep this somewhat simple. And then if we move on to the Mars period next, we see, okay, Mars is ruling that fourth house again, so once again some strong connection to mother, but it's gone actually to the sixth house, which is also the house of stepmother, for the record. And when the native was actually 2 during this Mars period, the native was given up for adoption overseas, and it is a great enemy, and the households which the person came into as an adoptee was the adoptive household the person went into had plenty of issues as well. And then we move into the Mercury period. The person had decent learning. It's in its own house. There wasn't that many problems around the learning per se. And then when the person entered into their Venus Dasha around 12, the household just totally started to fall apart. And, the adopted parents, went through a divorce, And, this whole kind of stage in this person's life had a lot of that Venus, Rahu energy. Sun's also there, except Sun's somewhat weak in the 7th house for a lot of reasons I won't get into. So, this person had a lot of Rahuvian kind of explorations with the relationships in this Venus period. Ended up becoming pregnant towards the end of it, and there was some go-between with the partner. The person wasn't so settled with their partner up until around the time of 32, which is when Jupiter came into play. And so now we move over to the 9th house, and we see Jupiter in the 9th house, and this person was found, got really heavily involved with the guru. They had met some years earlier, but really started to take shape. The person started settling down, didn't care so much about relationships anymore, got married with the father of her child. And we can see that there's that Venus influence isn't there anymore, and so it was a settled thing. So like in this chart, if this person hadn't gotten married by the time Jupiter turned, then there's not a good chance that she would have been married throughout her Jupiter period, and she might have had to wait until Sun period, when the child was fully grown and she could go out and everything, to really explore. But since she got married, then this energy was settled and she could focus on other things. And so right now this person is in their Jupiter period, and so looking forward, Sun will hit around 50, which will once again bring a different quality to the 7th house. It won't be so Venus-y, but there might be some health problems here because the health is getting afflicted by Rahu and things of this nature. And then once again in the later life it goes back to Saturn, which I won't get into for various reasons on this chart. But so yeah, you can see how we can kind of look at the basic indications there and get a basic read on how this is working. Now the Antar Dashas for Naisargika. Now this is there is some variation on what's given out there. However, the calculations are seen in Parashara, Jataka Parijata, Saravali, even Ptolemy, like I said, the Greek. So this is, Dasha is seen across a lot of different systems, especially in the Vedic texts. There is some basic foundational features of it that is given in all these texts. And so I want just a note to be careful with what you're seeing out there on the internet, because I've seen some calculations given by some very prominent internet astrologers that have absolutely nothing to do with the calculations given in the classical texts, and I have no idea where they're getting them from. So this is one, we're going to get into one way to calculate it. I'll show you what I use, what's based on the classical texts and what's taught in this tradition. And you can experiment and believe whoever you want. But anyways, the basics about the Antar Dasha is that it's based on a fractional weightage of planet placement from the Mahadasha Lord. So the calculation can be a little tricky if you're not used to it. But basically, you take the months within the Mahadasha and then you split it up into different fractions of that time based on where these placements are. And for the Dasha Lord, so if it's Jupiter Dasha, Jupiter gets 1, and then if any planet is conjunct with Jupiter, they get a 0.5%. And then if you see any planets 3rd and 10th from the Dasha, those get 3/4%. If there's any planets in trines, they get 1/3%. And then the 4th and 8th houses, they get 1/4%. The 7th house from the Dasha Lord, they get 1/7. And then if we see any planets in 2, 12, 6, 11, they also have a percentage of 1. Okay, now this is the basic structure. Now, one of the big things that's up for that you see some difference in the calculations that's being taught is, which order do these go in? And this is placed on